There's a man who walks through this world wearing two faces, and not metaphorically, literally. One name belongs to a boy born in the quiet corners of Italy, raised on dreams too big for the streets he grew up on. The other name belongs to someone else entirely, polished, curated, built for a world that rewards reinvention over authenticity. So which one is real? That question has followed this story for years. And the deeper you dig, the more unsettling the silence becomes. Because when someone constructs two identities, you have to ask, what were they running from? What truth was so uncomfortable, so raw, so deeply personal, that an entirely new name felt like the only way forward? Nancy Guthrie has spent years asking exactly that. She didn't stumble onto this story by accident. She was drawn to it, the way all the best investigators are, by the feeling that something just didn't add up. A detail here, a missing ear there, a smile that never quite reached the eyes in photographs taken when no one was supposed to be watching. Two names, one man, a lifetime of questions stacked between them like walls in a maze no one gave you a map for. Tommaso Cioni, Dominic Evans. By the time this documentary is over, you'll understand why both names matter and why only one of them tells the truth. Let's begin. Picture a small Italian town just before sunrise. The cobblestones are still wet from the night before. The air smells like espresso and old stone and something faintly electrical, the way mornings smell when the world is about to shift. In a modest apartment above a narrow street, a boy named Tommaso Cioni is already awake, not because anyone told him to be, but because the world inside his head never really goes quiet. He was the kind of child who noticed everything, the way light bent through cheap curtains, the way adults changed their voices depending on who was listening, the way some people wore their real feelings on their faces and others, the more interesting ones, kept everything locked behind a careful, practiced expression. Tommaso was one of the interesting ones. His family wasn't wealthy. They weren't struggling either. They existed in that particular middle space where pride runs deep and asking for help feels like a form of surrender. His parents worked. They were present. They were loving in the specific, unspoken way that certain Mediterranean households are loving, through meals, through sacrifice, through showing up even when no one says thank you. But Tommaso always felt like he was meant for somewhere else, not in an ungrateful way, in an urgent way, the kind of urgency that sits behind your sternum like a small fire, that no amount of ordinary living can extinguish. He read, he observed, he practiced languages, expressions, ways of presenting himself to a room. From an early age, he understood something that takes most people decades to grasp. Identity is not fixed. It is performed. And if you perform it well enough, for long enough, it becomes real. That insight would eventually become his greatest gift. It would also become the source of his most profound conflict, because somewhere between Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans, something happened. A decision was made, quietly, privately, with no press release and no announcement. A name was set down like a suitcase too heavy to carry any further, and a new one was picked up in its place. Nancy Guthrie first encountered the name Dominic Evans through a documentary project. She was researching on identity and reinvention in the digital age. She had a list of subjects. Most were unremarkable, but when she pulled the thread on Dominic Evans, something unexpected happened. The thread didn't just pull. It unraveled, and what she found beneath it was the boy from the cobblestone street, Tommaso Cioni, still very much alive, still very much present, and more complicated than any single name could ever contain. The first thing Nancy noticed was the gap. Every public profile for Dominic Evans began around the same period, a specific window of time, roughly 5 years back when accounts were created. A presence was established, and a professional identity began to take shape with almost suspicious neatness. Before that window, almost nothing. No digital footprint, no archived mentions, no photographs that predate that carefully chosen starting line. For most people, that kind of gap might mean nothing. Late adoption of social media, a private life consciously kept offline, reasonable explanations that exist for anyone willing to accept them. But Nancy wasn't looking at most people. She was looking at someone whose professional biography listed credentials, experiences, and connections that should have left traces. Conferences attended. Projects completed. Collaborations documented somewhere by someone. The absence wasn't just odd, it was architectural. It felt designed. So she started asking questions, gently at first, the way a good investigator always starts. She reached out through professional channels. She asked mutual contacts what they knew about Dominic Evans before the 5-year mark. She searched public records in multiple countries. And then, about 3 weeks into her research, a name surfaced. Not Dominic Evans. The other name. Tommasocioni. It appeared in a small reference. A footnote in a collaborative creative project published years earlier. The kind of thing that gets archived but rarely read. The work was credited to someone named Tommaso Cioni. The style, the voice, the conceptual approach, all of it matched, almost perfectly, the work now publicly attributed to Dominic Evans. Nancy sat with that discovery for a long time. She didn't rush to conclusions. That's not how Nancy Guthrie operates. Instead, she did what she always does. She went back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Dominic Evans, but the beginning of Tommaso Cioni. She started reconstructing a life from the fragments available, academic records in Italy, early creative work submitted under his birth name, connections to people who had known him before the reinvention began. What she found was not a story of deception for the sake of deception, that it was a story of survival. Tommaso had moved, physically, geographically, in his mid-20s. He left Italy for an English-speaking country, the way many ambitious young Europeans do, carrying a degree, a portfolio, and the specific loneliness of arriving somewhere no one knows your name or your history. In that environment, a foreign-sounding name becomes a silent tax. Doors that open easily for someone named David or James close slightly, just slightly, but noticeably, for someone named Tommaso. He didn't announce this. He didn't write about it. But the timeline speaks clearly enough. Within a year of arriving, Tommaso Cioni became functionally absent from any new professional records. Dominic Evans emerged in his place, anglicized, accessible, easier for English-speaking professional networks to receive without the slight, unconscious hesitation that greets the unfamiliar. It was a pragmatic decision made by a young man trying to build a life in a world that rewards those who make themselves easy to digest. But pragmatic decisions have long shadows, and Tommaso, or Dominic, depending on which version of the story you enter, was about to discover just how long those shadows could stretch. Here's what nobody tells you about reinventing yourself. The new name is the easy part. What's harder, significantly, profoundly harder, is the ongoing performance of continuity. The new name needs a consistent history. It needs a coherent story that can be told in cocktail party conversations, in professional bios, in the casual getting-to-know-you moments that stitch social lives together. Every new relationship built under the new name is built on a foundation that has a crack in it. Not a moral crack, necessarily, but a structural one. A place where the floor isn't quite solid. Dominic Evans became very good at managing that crack. He was warm, socially intelligent, professionally capable in ways that were entirely real. The talent had always been there, long before the name changed. Colleagues respected him. Some admired him. A few grew genuinely close to him, or close to the version of him that he allowed into the light. But there's something quietly lonely about being admired for a performance, even a performance built on real qualities. Nancy found this theme echoed in conversations with people who had known him. During the Dominic Evans years, they described someone who was present and engaged in professional settings, but who became subtly, almost imperceptibly distant whenever conversations turned personal. Questions about family, about childhood, about where he was from, these were answered with warmth and deflection simultaneously, a skill most people never noticed because the warmth was genuine enough to distract from the deflection. One person described it this way: he always made you feel like you were getting to know him, without ever actually letting you arrive. What was he protecting? That question sat at the center of Nancy's investigation for months, turning slowly, like something heavy suspended on a thread, because it wasn't reputation in the conventional sense. Tommaso Cioni had done nothing criminal, nothing scandalous, nothing that would unravel publicly if exposed. The name change was legally, Unregistered but socially practiced, common. Enough that it barely registers as unusual when viewed in isolation. No. What he was protecting was something quieter and more fragile than reputation. He was protecting the version of himself that had decided to start over. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with reinvention, one that rarely gets acknowledged because it doesn't fit the triumphant narrative we prefer to tell about people who rebuild themselves. The grief is this: when you walk away from one identity, you also walk away from everyone who loved that identity. The parents who called you by your childhood name, the friends who knew you before ambition reshaped you, the version of yourself that existed before you decided that version wasn't enough. Tommaso Cioni had left all of that behind, not with cruelty, but with the quiet, necessary brutality of someone who believed survival required it. What Nancy couldn't yet determine was whether he had made peace with that leaving, or whether it followed him into every room, every relationship, every quiet moment when the performance stopped and the man underneath sat alone with everything he'd set down and never quite picked back up. That answer would come, but not easily, and not without cost. Nancy requested a meeting. She didn't frame it as an investigation. She framed it as a conversation, which, in the most important sense, it genuinely was. She had spent enough time reconstructing this man's story from the outside that she wanted, finally, to understand what it looked like from within. The response came after a long silence. Not a refusal, not an agreement, a question sent back through an intermediary that told Nancy everything she needed to know about the man she was dealing with. He wanted to know what she already knew before he decided how much to reveal. That response was, in its own way, the most revealing thing he could have said. It confirmed that somewhere inside Dominic Evans, Tommaso Cioni was still very much on guard, still calculating, still managing the distance between what was known and what was felt. The instinct had become so ingrained over the years that it operated almost automatically, a reflex developed in early adulthood and never fully dismantled because it had never truly been safe enough to dismantle. Nancy answered honestly. She told him what she knew, the early work credited to his birth name, the timeline, the gap, the fragments she'd assembled into a shape that was recognizably his, even if it was still incomplete in the middle. Another silence followed. Then an agreement. Not enthusiastic, not relieved, the quiet agreement of someone who has been found and has decided, carefully, deliberately, that being found might finally be less exhausting than continuing to hide. The first conversation lasted almost for hours. Nancy described it later as one of the most careful conversations she had ever been part of. Careful in the way that a person is careful when they are genuinely afraid of what honesty might cost them, but are doing it anyway because they have reached the limit of what silence can hold. He talked about Italy, about the texture of the life he had left, not with bitterness, but with the particular tenderness of someone describing a place they can visit in memory, but can never quite return to as the person they once were. He talked about the name change with a directness that surprised even Nancy. He said he was not ashamed of it. He said shame was not the right word and had never been the right word, even though other people sometimes tried to apply it. He said the decision had been practical, yes, but it had also been something else, something he struggled to name precisely. But that had to do with the sensation of arriving somewhere new and wanting, for once, not to spend energy on the performance of explaining yourself before you had even been given the chance to simply be yourself. Dominic Evans was not a lie, he said. It was more like a door he had built, a door into a room where he could exist without the weight of context, without the footnotes. Nancy sat with that for a long time after the recording stopped. A door into a room where you could exist without footnotes. She had interviewed hundreds of people in her career. Very few of them had ever described their own identity with that kind of precision. But the door, it turned out, had costs. The further Nancy dug into the years following the name change, the more clearly a pattern emerged, not of deception succeeding cleanly, but of a man quietly paying for a decision that had seemed straightforward at 25 and grew progressively more complicated with every year that passed. Professional success arrived, and it was real. The talent that had driven Tommaso Cioni out of Italy and into a new country. And a new name did not disappear with the reinvention. It sharpened, if anything. Projects succeeded. Recognition came. The kind of modest, respected professional reputation that takes years to build and is genuinely earned. Not manufactured, but the personal life told a different story. Relationships, romantic, platonic, even some professional, had a recurring pattern. They reached a certain depth and then, almost predictably, stalled. Not dramatically, not in explosions of conflict or betrayal. They simply stopped deepening, as if there was an invisible wall just beyond intimacy's reach that no one could get past, because he couldn't quite bring himself to dismantle it. He had tried, he admitted. More than once, there had been a relationship. He didn't name the person, and Nancy didn't press, where he had come close, where the wall had come close to coming down entirely, where, for a period of months, the name Tommaso had been spoken aloud in a domestic space by someone who looked at him with full knowledge and did not look away. That relationship ended. He didn't explain exactly how or why, but the way he paused before moving on told Nancy everything. What does a man do with a grief he chose? That is the question that sits at the quiet, unspoken center of this story, patient and still, like water beneath ice. Because Tommaso Cioni, or Dominic Evans, or the man who contains both of them, did not have his identity taken from him. He made a decision, a rational, considered, understandable decision rooted in survival and ambition, and the very reasonable desire to be received by the world on his own terms, rather than through the filter of an unfamiliar name. And yet the grief is real. The loneliness is real. The cost, measured not in scandal or consequence, but in the accumulation of moments, where full honesty was withheld, where connection stopped just short of complete, where a version of yourself was kept in a drawer like a photograph you can't display, but can't throw away either. That cost is as real as any other kind. Nancy asked him, near the end of their final conversation, whether he thought the decision had been worth it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that has stayed with her since. He said, "I think I made the only decision I knew how to make with what I understood at the time. And I think that's true of almost every decision anyone ever makes. The question isn't whether it was worth it. The question is what you do with what it cost you." He paused. "Then, I'm still figuring that part out. In that moment, the mask, if it had ever really been a mask, was simply gone. What remained was a man. Complicated, recognizable, unfinished. Exactly like the rest of us. There is no villain in this story. There is no simple moral, no clean resolution, no moment where the camera pulls back and everything is neatly resolved. This is a story about the distance between who we are born and who we become, and about the quiet, ongoing work of closing that distance without losing yourself in the process. Tommaso Cioni built a door and walked through it and named himself something new. Whether that makes him brave or broken or simply human is not for this documentary to decide. It is for you to sit with. Nancy Guthrie has spent years asking the hard questions, not to expose, but to understand, not to judge, but to illuminate. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think about the names you carry and the ones you've set down along the way, that is enough. That is exactly what it was made for. If you want to follow more of Nancy's work, the link is below.